It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where you barely saw anyone outside unless it was for a friendly wave or a brief chat at the mailbox. People minded their own business, each caught up in their own world. It was safe, predictable. And then there was him, Victor, the man who had recently moved in next door. I didn't know much about him at first. He was reclusive, kept to himself, and rarely interacted with anyone. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. His unkempt, dark hair and pale complexion made him look tired, like someone who had been through something, or was hiding something. But it wasn't until one evening, when I saw him from my living room window, that I started to notice the oddities. He was carrying something large and heavy in a trash bag, struggling to drag it from his backyard to the alley behind his house. I couldn't tell what it was, but it was strange. The bag seemed unusually stiff, as though the contents weren't just garbage. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but my heart skipped a beat when I saw something dark dripping from the bottom of the bag. A chill ran down my spine. I turned away from the window, telling myself I was overthinking it. It could have been anything, but that nagging feeling wouldn't leave me. Something about that scene felt wrong, like I had just witnessed a moment I wasn't meant to see. The next day, I noticed that the air around his house had changed. There was a heaviness to it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to ignore the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. Days passed, and my mind continued to circle around that strange night. The image of Victor hauling the mysterious, stiff bag behind his house was burned into my memory. It lingered like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over my every thought. I tried to dismiss it. After all, I had no concrete evidence of anything sinister. But every time I glanced over at his house, that nagging feeling returned, stronger and more persistent. I wasn't one to meddle in other people's business, but something about Victor seemed off. He always avoided eye contact when we did cross paths, and his responses to any casual greetings were brief and awkward. It was as if he had built an invisible wall between himself and the rest of the world, a barrier I couldn't break through no matter how much I tried. Then, a few days after the incident with the bag, I overheard something that only added to the mystery. It was late in the evening when I heard raised voices coming from Victor's house. My curiosity piqued. I moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. From the shadows of my living room, I could just make out the faint silhouette of Victor standing in the front yard, speaking with a woman. Their conversation was hushed but intense. I couldn't make out all the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a mix of anger and desperation. The woman seemed upset, her body language frantic as she gestured toward his house. I strained to hear, my heart pounding in my chest, but the only word I caught clearly was help. I felt an icy grip of fear clench around my chest. What was going on over there? Who was this woman, and why did she seem so distressed? More importantly, why had she come to Victor, of all people? As quickly as the confrontation began, it ended. The woman stormed off, her figure vanishing down the street. Victor stood motionless for a moment before disappearing inside his house. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty street, my mind racing. The next day I noticed something else that further disturbed me. It was early in the morning, and I was getting my mail when I saw Victor standing in his front yard. He was holding something, another large trash bag, similar to the one I had seen him struggling with a few days earlier. But this time the bag was different. It was sealed tightly at the top, and there was a dark red stain near the bottom, a stain that looked too much like blood. I couldn't stop myself. My heart thudded in my chest, and before I could think better of it, I crossed the street and approached him. "Hey, Victor," I called out, trying to sound casual. "Everything okay?" He looked up, his face going briefly pale before quickly regaining his composure. He smiled, but there was something off about it. Too forced, too practiced. "Everything's fine," he said, his voice too smooth. "Just taking out the trash." I nodded, but my eyes couldn't help but flicker down to the bag he was holding. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked, Is that something heavy? You've been carrying some large bags around lately." Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. For a moment I thought he was going to say something more, but he simply shook his head and gave a tight-lipped smile. "Just some old stuff," he said, his voice clipped. "Nothing to worry about." But the way he said it only deepened my suspicions. Something in his eyes told me he was lying, that he was hiding something. I tried to push the feeling away, but it lingered like a shadow, trailing me wherever I went. That afternoon, as I was in my kitchen preparing dinner, I noticed something even stranger. From my window, I saw a faint movement in the corner of my eye. Victor was outside again, this time standing near the back of his house. He was bent over, digging something into the ground, the motion slow and deliberate. I couldn't make out what he was doing, but the way his hands moved was almost ritualistic. I grabbed my phone and took a picture through the window, but it was blurry, too far away to make out any real details. I didn't know what to do with this information. I was no detective, and I had no proof of anything, only my gut feeling that something was terribly wrong. The days dragged on, each one blurring into the next, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. Victor became more distant, his strange behavior more frequent. I had the feeling that whatever he was hiding was closing in on me, like a trap I didn't know how to escape from. One evening, as I was sitting on my couch, I heard a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't been expecting anyone. When I opened the door, there stood Victor, his face pale and eyes wide. His hand trembled as he held out a small envelope. "I need your help," he whispered urgently. His voice was shaky, unlike anything I had ever heard from him before. "Please, you have to come with me." I hesitated. Victor's sudden appearance at my doorstep, coupled with the desperate urgency in his voice, left me feeling both curious and wary. My instincts screamed at me to decline, to shut the door and lock myself inside. But something, perhaps a morbid fascination, perhaps guilt, compelled me to listen. "What is it?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "What's going on, Victor?" He looked over his shoulder nervously, as though checking to see if anyone was watching. Then, without saying another word, he stepped into the house, his eyes flicking around as though he were trying to ensure that he wasn't being followed. "Just come with me," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You'll see for yourself." I froze, my mind racing. I didn't know what to expect, but the intensity in his eyes was enough to make me feel both alarmed and compelled. I didn't want to follow him, didn't want to get involved in whatever twisted thing was going on. But a nagging voice inside me pushed me forward, urging me to understand the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. With a mixture of fear and curiosity, I grabbed my coat and followed him out the door. Victor led me around the back of his house, where a tall wooden fence separated the property from the neighboring ones. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the yard, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. There was a strange tension in the atmosphere, as though the very ground we walked on held secrets. He stopped at a small shed at the back of the yard, barely noticeable in the shadow of the house. It was old, the wood weathered and chipped, but it had a certain permanence to it, like it had been there for years, quietly watching the world change. Victor reached for the doorknob, but then he paused, turning to look at me with an expression that was both apologetic and fearful. "I'm sorry you had to get involved in this," he said, his voice trembling, "but I don't know who else to turn to." Before I could respond, he pushed the door open and motioned for me to enter. Reluctantly, I stepped inside, my senses overwhelmed by the musty, dank smell that hit me like a wall. The shed was cramped, filled with shadows that danced in the flickering light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There were boxes, old tools, and what looked like piles of discarded items. Junk, really. But then my eyes caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. In the corner of the shed, there was a table. It was stained with something dark and red, and scattered across it were various tools, knives, scalpels, and what looked like surgical equipment. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a shed. It was a place for something far darker, something far more sinister. Victor followed my gaze, his face pale as he let out a shaky breath. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," he muttered. "I thought I could stop. I thought I could control it." "Control what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is all of this?" Victor swallowed hard, his eyes never leaving the table. "You don't understand, but I have to show you. It's the only way." My heart raced, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to run as fast as I could, but my feet felt rooted to the spot as if the shed itself had a hold on me. Victor finally turned to face me, his eyes wild with fear and regret. "It's the hunger," he whispered. "It's always been there, lurking inside me. I've tried to fight it, but every time it gets stronger. Every time it pulls me deeper into this madness." He motioned toward the table. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want to become like them. But I had no choice. I had to survive. And now, his voice faltered. "Now I can't stop. Not anymore." The room seemed to close in around me as the weight of his words sank in. My mind struggled to make sense of what he was saying. It felt like something out of a nightmare, something I couldn't wake up from. You're a cannibal," I said, the words barely leaving my mouth as I processed the horror of it all. Victor's gaze dropped to the floor, his hands shaking as he clenched them into fists. "Yes, I didn't want to become this person, but it's in me. The hunger, the need. I can't escape it." I took a step back, my stomach turning. The truth was unbearable, like a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. Victor's voice grew softer, almost pleading. "Please, you have to understand. I never meant to hurt anyone. But when you're starving, when the hunger takes over..." He trailed off, his words hollow and desperate. Before I could say anything, he moved toward a corner of the shed, pulling out a large, blood-stained plastic bag. My breath caught in my throat as he carefully unrolled it, revealing the contents inside. There, wrapped in the bag, was a human limb. I gasped, my hands trembling, as the reality of the situation crashed over me. This wasn't just some strange confession. This was real. Victor had been killing people, presumably to feed his insatiable appetite. "I've been hiding it," Victor continued, his voice raw. "But they keep coming. The need, the hunger. It won't stop. And now I can't hide it anymore." I felt my knees weaken, and I stumbled back, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't breathe. "You've got to stop," I choked out, though I wasn't sure who I was trying to convince, Victor or myself. But the look on his face was empty, hollow. "I can't," he whispered, his eyes filled with despair. "I've gone too far. There's no turning back now." The silence in the shed was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the bulb above us. My heart pounded so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear Victor's labored breathing. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls shifting closer with every passing second. I wanted to run, to flee from this nightmare and never look back, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My mind raced, desperately trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Victor's confession hung in the air, thick and oppressive. There was no denying what he had done, no pretending that this was some twisted joke or a misunderstanding. The blood-stained limb in front of me was all the proof I needed. My stomach churned, and I could feel the bile rise in my throat. I wanted to scream, to confront him with every ounce of my anger and fear, but instead, I found myself frozen. He was standing there trembling, the horror of his own actions reflected in his eyes. I could see the conflict in his face, the desperation, the guilt, the pain. He wasn't a monster, or at least not entirely. He was a man trapped in a nightmare of his own making, caught in a cycle of addiction so deep that he could see no way out. "Victor?" My voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but he heard me. His gaze flickered up to meet mine, and I could see the raw vulnerability in his eyes. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I couldn't control it. It's like it takes over me and I can't stop it." The words felt hollow, like an apology that couldn't undo the horror of his actions. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, disgust, confusion. But there was one thought that stood out among the chaos. How had I not seen this coming? Victor had always been a little strange, a little distant, but I had never suspected anything like this. How had I missed the signs? The way he always seemed nervous, the odd hours he kept, the strange odors that sometimes emanated from his house. But I had brushed it all off as quirks, just harmless eccentricities. And now, I stood here, trapped in this hellish reality, with no idea of how to escape it. I backed away slowly, trying to create some space between myself and the gruesome sight in front of me. Victor reached out, his hand shaking, pleading for me to stay. "Please," he begged, his voice desperate. "You have to help me. You're the only one who can help me." The tears in his eyes made my chest tighten. I didn't know what to do. What could I do? He had confessed to killing people, to becoming something monstrous, and yet there was still that flicker of humanity in him. He was begging for help, but was it too late for him? Was it even possible to pull him back from this abyss? "I don't know if I can help you," I whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal. "I don't even know how to help myself right now." Victor's face crumpled, and he sank to his knees, his hands clutching at his hair as he sobbed. The sound was agonizing, a raw expression of pain and regret that cut through me like a knife. He wasn't a monster. He was a broken man, lost in his own torment. But that didn't change what he had done, the lives he had taken, the horrors he had unleashed. And now, there was no going back. "I'm sorry," he whispered again and again, as if those words could undo the damage, as if they could erase the blood on his hands. I felt sick to my stomach, torn between pity and revulsion. I knew I should leave, should run as far away from this madness as possible. But I couldn't. I couldn't abandon him. Not entirely. There was something deep inside me, some flicker of compassion that refused to turn away completely. "Victor, what do you need me to do?" I asked, my voice barely audible, but steady. I had to know what I was getting myself into. I couldn't walk into this blind. "How can I help you?" He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears and his eyes filled with something between hope and desperation. "I can't stop. I can't control it anymore. It's too far gone. But there's a way out. A way for me to end it all. But I need someone to help me. To end this." I felt a chill run down my spine. End it all. What did that mean? Was he asking me to help him die? To end his life so that he could no longer hurt anyone else? "You want me to help you die?" I asked, my voice trembling. Victor nodded, his face pale, eyes hollow. "Please, it's the only way. If I don't, the hunger will come back. It always comes back." I felt the weight of his words settle over me like a crushing boulder. This wasn't just about helping him. It was about deciding whether I could live with the consequences of what he was asking. Could I really end his life, knowing the pain he had endured? Was it mercy? Or was it just the easy way out? I stared at him, torn, my heart warring with my head. The desperation in his eyes, the raw human anguish. But could I really take such a step? Could I pull the trigger, so to speak, on this man I once considered a neighbor, even a friend? I can't do that, I said finally, the words sounding final even though they felt like a betrayal. I can't help you end it. Victor's expression shifted, deflated. For a moment he seemed to shrink in on himself, as if the very life had been drained from him. Then there's nothing left, he whispered, his voice hollow. I couldn't stand to see him like this, so broken, so lost. But I had no answers. I was as trapped as he was, bound by a situation too dark to comprehend, too twisted to fix. I'm sorry, Victor, I said, my voice thick with sorrow. I really am. Victor didn't respond. He just sat there, his shoulders hunched, staring at the blood-stained table. The weight of his confession, his guilt, his torment, it filled the room like a suffocating fog. And then, without another word, he stood up, walked over to the door, and opened it. He didn't look back. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do next. The door was still open, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I could leave now, I could run. But something inside me held me there, unwilling to let go of this tragic situation so easily. I was caught in a web of darkness, one that neither Victor nor I could escape. And for the first time in my life, I felt the cold, unrelenting grip of fear, not just for myself, but for the world that had allowed this nightmare to unfold. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread still heavy in my chest. I hadn't heard from Victor since the night before. Had he gone through with it? Had he ended it all? I tried to push the thought from my mind, but I couldn't. The darkness was already creeping in, consuming everything. And in the quiet of the early morning, I realized something chilling. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was mine too. As the door creaked open, a sense of finality washed over me. I had no idea what awaited me, but I knew I couldn't stay in this house any longer. The oppressive atmosphere, the strange happenings, the fear, it had all become too much. I had to escape, even if I didn't fully understand what was going on. I took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway. The hallway was dark, with only a faint light from a dim lamp in the distance illuminating the edges. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and frantic, echoing against the walls. The silence around me felt like a trap, like the house itself was waiting for me to make a wrong move. I walked slowly, trying to steady my nerves, but every step felt like it took me deeper into the heart of the house, where the walls seemed to close in around me. The house felt alive, as though it was aware of my every move. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the wind sent a chill down my spine. I reached the stairs and paused, looking down at the shadows below. There was no turning back now. I had to find a way out of here, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, I descended. The darkness grew heavier with each step, and as I reached the bottom, I saw a light flickering from underneath a door at the end of the hallway. It was too familiar. A room I had seen before. It was the room where it all began. The room where I first met Thomas. As I approached the door, my heart raced. I knew I should turn back. I knew I should flee and never look back, but something drew me in. A sense of inevitability. I had to confront whatever truth was waiting behind that door. I opened it slowly. What I saw inside made my stomach turn. Claire and Thomas stood in the center of the room, the dim light casting strange shadows across their faces. They looked different. There was something unsettling in the way they stood, something inhuman, and then I saw it. The table in the center of the room covered with strange objects, jars filled with dark liquids, and pieces of flesh. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. "You finally made it," Claire said, her voice distant and detached. "We were wondering when you'd come down." "What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Thomas stepped forward, his eyes cold and empty. "This is the truth, Elizabeth. This is who we are." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just strange neighbors. They were part of something far darker, something ancient and terrifying. The flesh on the table. It wasn't just any meat. It was human. I took a step back, horror flooding my senses. My vision blurred, and I felt the weight of their words settle on me like a heavy cloak. You're cannibals," I said, my voice shaking with disbelief. Claire smiled. "Not just cannibals, Elizabeth. We're part of a greater purpose, a family, a tradition that has been passed down for generations. It's not about hunger. It's about power, about control." Thomas nodded, his eyes gleaming with a cold, unfeeling light. "You see, we don't just take what we need. We take what we deserve. And we've been waiting for you to understand." "Understand?" I croaked, my throat dry. "Understand what?" Claire's smile widened, a twisted expression of satisfaction. "That you're part of this now, Elizabeth. You're one of us. You've been chosen." My mind was racing. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were scattered, unable to form a coherent sentence. This was a nightmare. This couldn't be real. "Now," Thomas said, "you can join us. You can become a part of this. You've already seen too much. There's no turning back." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me as the truth sank in. They had been grooming me, watching me, waiting for me to stumble upon their dark secret. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not now. In that moment, I felt a surge of adrenaline. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. I had to escape. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me as they chased me down the hallway. But I was faster now. The adrenaline coursing through my veins pushed me forward. I reached the front door and yanked it open, the cool night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I didn't stop running. I ran until my legs burned, until I couldn't hear the sound of their pursuit anymore. I didn't look back. Weeks later, I found myself in a different town, far from the house and the nightmare I had escaped. But the memories still haunted me, creeping into my thoughts in the dead of night. I never spoke to anyone about what had happened. No one would believe me. Who would believe that my neighbors were cannibals, part of some twisted, ancient cult? But I knew the truth, and I knew one thing for sure. I would never be the same. I had seen the darkness that lived in the shadows, and it would follow me for the rest of my life.